Okay, I think we'll get started.
Yes, it is.
I'm Craig Lent from Electrical Engineering. This is Peter Distelzweig from Philosophy at St. Thomas University in St. Paul. It's our pleasure to host Father Joachim Ostermann today. We understand this is a reading day, so lots of students are off, and I appreciate those that came. Joachim Ostermann, before entering religious life, earned a Ph.D. in biochemistry from the University of Munich in 1990 for his work on mitochondrial biogenesis. After postdoctoral work in cell biology at the Sloan Kettering Institute in New York, he joined the faculty of biochemistry at Vanderbilt University. In 2001, he moved to Canada to work in research management positions in the biotechnology industry. He was a co-founder of a very successful biotech firm that gave him considerable resources. So that's when the story takes an interesting twist. In 2008, he joined the Orders of Friars Minor. He professed his solemn vows in 2013 and was ordained to the priesthood in 2014. Now his research interests are in the philosophy of science and religion and the implication of the scientific worldview on religious understandings of the human person. It's a great pleasure to welcome him to Notre Dame.
It's very nice for me to be here, and while I speak frequently publicly in my new line of work, I realized when I was preparing for this trip, this is the first time that I got an academic invitation in, I think, 16 or 17 years. So I'm very happy to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be again at the center of learning and to speak about the things that I've learned and to share it with you. What I'm showing you here on my first slide depicts a very important moment in the life of St. Francis, which is meeting the leper. And it is really very essential to understand what happened in this moment, because otherwise you can't fully understand Francis and be inspired by his life. So Francis, that is St. Francis of Assisi, did not have a Christian worldview. Instead, his being in the world was seeing Christ. And I will try to explain this in a little more detail, but I want to emphasize this right off the bat. And I do so because maybe you object to speaking of worldviews as if one could capture all of it in one of them. And I quite agree. Science, the arts, and religion each speak of the world in very different ways. But I want to argue here that there's one focal point and one center, one point of departure for all that is meaningful, and this includes science. Now, I do not know how many of you really share the faith of Francis and myself, the faith that sees the Word of God disclosed in the person of Christ. And irrespective of your commitment to affirming or denying this proposition, I want you to understand why the philosophical understanding of the human person must come first. Science has to remain grounded in this understanding. This doesn't mean some kind of psychologism with respect to the understanding of science, and it doesn't mean questioning the self-sufficiency of science in seeking a resolution to its own problems. It does mean, however, that if science is not seen as already building on the knowledge of the human person's original self-understanding, then it has nothing to contribute to what is of the greatest interest to us. And this is what it means to be a human person. Now, I consider this ordering of precedence essential for understanding the relationship between faith and science without making a mess of either or even both of them. Only when we put things in this order can we refer to science as well as faith when trying to answer the ancient philosophical question of what it means to live well rather than just live. And human flourishing requires an integrated understanding of human well-being, and this requires an understanding how the human person relates to the world as it is understood by science. Now, back to Francis. When he reflected on his life, not long before his death, he wrote his testament, the last writing we have of him, and in it he remembers an unexpected encounter with a leper, and he writes about it when he begins his testament. And I have it there on the slide. The Lord gave me, Brother Francis, thus to begin doing penance in this way. For when I was in sin, it seemed too bitter for me to see lepers. And the Lord himself led me among them, and I showed mercy to them. And when I left them, what had seemed bitter to me was turned into sweetness of soul and body. And afterwards I delayed a little and left the world. And then in the rest of the testament, he speaks more of his spirituality and the early experience of the fraternity. But this event is what he remembered as the turning point in his life. Now, there are different ways of seeing this encounter. The brothers of the early Franciscan movement in the 13th century were both working and preaching. That was the essence of their charism. And many of them worked in leprosaria. And this is often interpreted as evidence for the friars' attachment to the poor and to marginalized people. It is important, though, to take full account of modern scholarship about the 13th century, and this has dismissed many of the false assumptions that we tend to make about the Middle Ages. In Francis's day, in the 13th century, leprosaria were a lot like monasteries, not so much communities of the excluded. Leprosy in the 13th century was not known to be a communicable disease, and the advantages of isolation were not known until centuries later. But due to the disfiguring nature of leprosy, the person who was afflicted with this illness was seen as bearing the wounds of Christ. Through their suffering with Christ, the lepers knew themselves reconciled with God in Christ, and this made them symbols of Christ in the medieval world. Therefore, care for them was an equal part compassionate care and also religious worship. And it was very much part of the social order of Francis's days. But for Francis, all of it comes together in this moment. The encounter with Christ, showing mercy and receiving mercy, understanding all creatures as praising God. But it was not an insight, it was an encounter with a person, in the recognition of a person, that his whole world made sense again. And how to make sense of the world is very much what this talk is about. Now, when I began my own studies, after many years studying the natural sciences, I learned about the philosophy of Thomas of Aquinas. And my first encounter was not at all a happy one. To be honest, a book ended up being thrown into a corner in an outburst of anger, because I simply could not see how I could connect this mode of thinking with what I had learned in the natural sciences. It was too far removed from what I had learned in the sciences. It simply did not fit. And it collided with the physicalism that I had implicitly accepted in my own way of thinking. But now in retrospect, this helps me to understand what it is that we need to overcome when engaging physicalism. Now, I should probably clarify what I mean when I speak of science, and what I mean of the physical sciences, or sciences that claim to be reducible or seek to be reducible to physics. And sometimes we may refer to physics or natural sciences to be more precise. You may have noticed my first language is German, so I'm familiar with the word Wissenschaft, the German word for science, which has a much broader meaning than the natural sciences. It means making of knowledge wherever it can be found. But for now, as we are talking about physicalism and trying to engage it, I will use the term science in the narrower sense of the word. Now, I hope you're not scandalized to hear that I very much enjoy the Big Bang Theory, and by that I mean the TV show, because the extra cosmological theory requires mathematical expertise that goes far beyond my training. And here's a dialogue that very nicely sums up the show. Sheldon claiming that he knows everything because he's a theoretical physicist, and Penny reminding him rather quickly that it is not that simple. And it seems to me that throughout the whole show, the running gag is physicalism's claim to speak of everything, or at least of everything that is important. So why would anybody even consider physicalism a viable philosophy? Because it's, at least in its most naive interpretations, like this one, it is very easily refuted. The statement that all that is true is what is known by physics is in itself not a statement in physics. So permitting exclusively the addition of the statement to what is true is arbitrary, and no argument for doing so is given or could be given. The statement that physicalism is true permits a discourse about whether worldviews are true or false. And if one of them is true, why does it follow from there that there couldn't be two or 73 or infinitely many worldviews? Now, there are also others and more interesting ways to critique physicalism. The one that I consider most useful in practical dialogue is to point out the reality of one's own existence, persisting through all kinds of changes from conception to death, while not corresponding to any specific entity in physics. And anyone who claims to have studied this line of reasoning in the past, only to reject it, has already lost the argument. Otherwise, you couldn't make the point. Here's another one. Ask whether theoretical physics is merely a phenomenon within neurobiology, and argue that neurobiology is actually more general and prior to theoretical physics. This, incidentally, if you watch this show, leads to the first lover spat between Sheldon and Amy Farrah Fowler. But of course, neurobiology presupposes the physical understanding of nature and its use of biochemistry, so it cannot come first. So it is simply too easy to see that the naive physicalism of the popular science literature is false. So the problem must be elsewhere. And the real question is, why is physicalism attractive at all? And what is it that makes it an adversary that must be engaged? And we have to understand this problem before we can make some progress in persuading people to question their attraction to physicalism. Now, even while I will critique physicalism, we have to acknowledge the power of reductionism. And the picture here shows a plant, and this plant makes a poison, a very powerful poison, that can be quite useful if you're hunting with arrows and do not have the benefit of firearms. And next to it is the structure of the poison in that plant. I'm a chemist in my training, so I like structures like that. And you can see a very well-defined arrangement of individual atoms, each in its place, according to the rule of chemistry, with no ambiguity whatsoever. So this is science. But how real is this depiction of the poison in the plant? Is it more or less real or equally real as the plant and its properties? Which users were known long before the poison's chemistry was analyzed. A chemist would argue in favor of realism. One can synthesize this poison from simple and readily available components, and then show the synthetic poison is just as effective as the one naturally obtained. And a chemist would argue that the naturally obtained and artificially made poison are the same, and that it makes no difference how it was obtained. He would argue in this way, even if the total synthesis had not been accomplished. And in this view, the chemical structure speaks best about what is really real in this poison, and all else is just commentary on this reality. Now we have a problem, and here it is. I think the groundhog is my example. I think dogs and cats are overused as example, but also because there was a very interesting and happy time for me in my novitiate year when I was at St. Bonaventure University in upstate New York, and we had courses in Franciscan studies there, and there were many groundhogs on that campus. So the groundhog has now become my example for my case here. And of course, the groundhog can be seen as nothing else than an assembly of organs, which are assemblies of cells, which are assemblies of molecules, of atoms, of protons and electrons, quarks and leptons, strings, and who knows what else comes below that. The trouble with this is that it truly questions the reality of the animal as a whole. Now for me, as a chemist turned biochemist turned cell biologist, and then Franciscan, but that's a different story, the middle parts are the ones that I know best. I can see how I can move upward or downward through these middle parts, and I can see how the simple becomes complex and the complex becomes simple. And chemists know how the laws about atoms determine the properties of molecules, and biochemists know how the molecules build subcellular structures, and cell biologists know how the subcellular structures form and govern the functioning of cells. The layers are not independent from each other. Each has its own properties and laws, but different layers of complexity are based on the same combination of parts. That does not mean that the groundhog is nothing more than the sum of its parts. And this is not so easy to refute. The trouble is that what happens at one level is determined by what happens at the level below. Cell biology seeks conclusions by way of biochemistry, and biochemistry by way of chemistry, chemistry by way of physics. And this hierarchical nature of these explanations and the explanatory success of them is really the problem. The reductionism implied in it is the problem. So Thomism did not really help me at all, even once I did gain the patience to study it in detail, to respond to this challenge. I can see how one can apply Thomistic Aristotelian philosophy to describe reality at various levels, such as at chemistry, biochemistry, or cell biology. Thomism could claim that they all exist, each at its proper level before they're taken up at a higher level, like building blocks in a complex assembly. But what do we really gain, what do we accomplish by simply re-articulating the results of physical science in Thomistic language? Try to make the same that the groundhog, as a whole, has new and emergent properties in addition to what is known on the basis of its simpler components. But if this were true, if emergentism could be real, how could it work? It runs against the explanatory power of reductionistic explanation making. Complex organismal behavior, such as how a bacterium searches for food, is readily explained at the molecular level. Why should this be different for the behavior of the groundhog? And there's simply no room for newness to emerge within the structure of the physical world. The most we can do is to give names as shorthand expressions for the complex combination of parts and their properties that we observe. The problem in responding to physicalism is the explanatory success of reductionism. It fails to have the defects that one would expect if there were top-down causality or the whole governing the parts. And this is why I see a very stark choice when looking at this groundhog, and I can't quite see how to avoid it. Either accept reductionism or deny that physics is a true description of the specific and individual being before us. I'm arguing for the latter. Deny that physics is a true description of the being before me. This, however, now needs to be done with the greatest care and subtlety. It is just about impossible to deny that physics gives us true knowledge of the world. We cannot dismiss physics, and we cannot treat it as some kind of optional or lesser truth. Indeed, I find the power of physics to convince everyone who studies it powerful evidence against any kind of relativism. At the same time, the power of physics to explain observable phenomena by referring to a world far removed from human existence, such as galaxies or times long before human existence, is a powerful argument against idealism that is all in our mind. The world of physics is clearly not just an idea in our mind, as it goes far beyond such confines. So I'm in a difficult spot. But maybe you can see that I left myself a little bit of wiggle room by distinguishing between the being before me and the world. And I hope that the significance of making this distinction will become clearer as I continue. Now, rejecting reductionism should come easy, as there's something clearly missing from the reductionist picture. It is really just about impossible to deny that in the groundhog as a whole, something new has emerged. the groundhog is alive. But what does it mean that the groundhog is alive? It apparently means a whole lot to the groundhogs themselves. Whenever they got too close, they were quick to run into the burrows. But for the observer of the groundhog, in its molecular details, life means nothing much really. It is just a system of biochemical reaction cycles that remains far from equilibrium for a little while until something goes wrong and it all breaks down. Then the groundhog is no more, maybe because it is eaten up by bugs and worms and microorganisms, and its parts become parts of something else. So life is an evident problem for those who want to affirm the truth of the physical sciences, but think that they can be supplemented in some way to avoid these stark reductionist conclusions. It is indeed an evident reality, but it corresponds to nothing new in the physical description of reality. We cannot go back to the days of vitalism and claim that somewhere in there some new and yet to be discovered force awaits our discovery, next to the forces we already know. Such theories are gone for good. We need to look for another way. Before we get there, here's another part of the problem. Look at the strange way in which I had isolated the groundhog in the earlier picture. In this picture, much less has been abstracted. Actual animals in real life are always part of some ecological system. Then there's something else that you cannot see. The groundhog, or any other kind of complex animal, is host to a legion of microorganisms without which it could not live. You and I, if we think of ourselves as bodies or beings with bodies that are coded in human DNA, are actually a minority in our own bodies. There are more bacteria and eukaryotic single-celled organisms in our being than there's human cells in our being. We are not simply living in ecosystems, we are ecosystems. We are ecosystems in ecosystems. Otherwise we couldn't live. There are many ways in which science takes such a holistic, global perspective at the world. When speaking of living beings in biology, then there's really only one incontestable, unified whole, which is life as a whole on this planet. And one quite unorthodox but very interesting way in which the thought is taken very seriously is the Gaia hypothesis. And according to Lynn Margulis, it works very well to explain the evolutionary development of life. It works especially well in explaining the importance of cooperativity in the transition from simpler to more complex forms of life. In my own academic life, I encountered Lynn Margulis' work as an explanation for mitochondria. The endosymbiont hypothesis is Lynn Margulis' work. So, and then in physics, there are several all-embracing holisms in which the parts are entirely lost in the total. Quantum mechanics is the most radical in this respect, and people don't always appreciate how radical it is. Quantum mechanics rules out speaking of individual electrons in an atom or a molecule like chemists like to do. There's one wave function for the whole, rather than individual wave functions for individual parts. And there are different kinds of particles and different kinds of assemblies of them, but there's no meaningful way to speak of individuality for one specific representative of one particle. And even this is not entirely true, because even in classical physics, the future of the whole is governed by all of its parts. The forces of classical mechanics have infinite reach, so no part can really be seen as being independent of all else. So these holisms, note the plural, lead to the question, why is there a multiplicity of some things rather than just one everything? I find this a very important question, and I think that asking it leads us to see how we can keep together a multiplicity of different ways of looking at the world without needing to bring them into competition with each other. Now, the some things are certainly not to be found at the bottom of the physical description of the world. The search for fundamentality might continue ad infinitum, that we will never reach the bottom. But even if there are truly fundamental particles to be found at the bottom, then they would have lost all individual identity once we can only speak of them in terms of quantum mechanics. Science gives us an everything of sorts, and the laws that govern it. But it really does not give us a good basis for seeing the somethings that surround us as individual beings. In the scientific description, they have lost all of their individual existence, and they're merely assembly of parts and parts of assemblies. So let us look at this picture one more time. There's the debris of broken wood on the ground. There are grasses, various plants with leaves. And I quite doubt that you could tell me how many plants there are, or how many pieces of wood, and just think what kind of questions we could ask by trying to count the kind of things which are on the ground. The ground clearly is its own kind of everything, the kind of everything that I do not care to distinguish into its individual constituents, as I know very well that this is pointless. The plants I could organize but not count. I could count species, but not the number of exemplars of each species. That gets very hard to do in plants. Yet, we can all agree there are 4 groundhogs in this picture. There are 4 of them, and if one of them is hidden, we won't worry about it. And they are all groundhogs. One sits apart, for reasons known to it alone, maybe it needed to feel its individuality, needed to feel that it was itself, rather than just one of 4. The groundhog's psyche is not our concern, but the question here goes to the very depth of what we can understand about reality. There are 4 of them, maybe 5 if one is hidden, but not 3. And they're groundhogs, not butterflies. So this much is very clear. But now we have a substantial problem. How can we be so sure of these simple insights about individuals and their nature? How do we know that they are individual beings of a certain kind, rather than just a whole with transient groundhog-shaped features emerging here and there for a little while? So this question now goes to the question of what is real and why do we say so. And at this point, you may start wondering whether it's all only figments of the imagination. But when you discuss with people how they make sense of the world, you will find that everybody is a realist about something. But when it comes to a science which tends to express knowledge that we should all agree on, how do we know that any of its entities are as real as the groundhogs in the previous picture? There are few scientists who would doubt realism in the things they observe, even if they observe them only indirectly. It becomes a challenge, though, when you think of the universe in the first second after the Big Bang, or when you think of the world of dinosaurs, or any other period on Earth long before human beings, or subatomic particles. In spite of the distance from human experience, the explanatory power of scientific theories is so strong that it seems absurd to question the reality of the events and entities that are implied. But it's not quite so simple. The realist interpretation of science has its own presuppositions. When we ask, what is the thing, then we have already made an assumption about reality. There seems to be some individual thing we want to know whether it is and what it is. Maybe it's a figment of our imagination. If so, we want to rule it out. It seems obvious, but we have to point it out. There's already knowledge of reality before we even think about it, and certainly long before we do science. Now, I promised some Franciscan insights, and to understand this better, it helps to go back a long time, long before modern science. And I want to draw your attention to one Franciscan scholar of the Middle Ages. His name is Duns Scotus. Born around 1266 in Scotland, he entered the Franciscan order at a young age and became one of the friar's most respected scholars. He taught in Paris and then moved to Cologne, where he died in 1308. Now, the medieval scholars did not worry about individuality in the way that I presented it here. The holism of the physical sciences that blurs the borders between distinct beings was not known to them. The existence of individual beings was an evident fact. What they struggled with was a question of how are universals present in each and every individual. And the medieval scholastics found it quite a logical challenge to assert realism for universals. Duns Scotus was dissatisfied with existing answers to the question of individuation, such as the solution provided by Thomas Aquinas, that signate matter, or matter considered under determinate dimensions, was the principle of individuation. I cannot go into the details of Scotus's rejection of this and other proposals, except by saying that Scotus considered it impossible that something that is changeable in the individual could be the reason for an individual's existence as an individual. So Scotus's response is to introduce what he calls, in this quote here, the individual entity, or what is later called hexeitas, or thisness. And his case for this principle is complicated, and later Franciscans, such as William of Ockham, dispensed with these complications and began a development that would take us into nominalism, which is the thought that the natures common to different individuals are merely names that we apply to express our understanding of what these individuals share. But Scotus argues that the reality of an individual is both its thisness and its nature. Both together form into the being that this individual is. So a thisness is not a set of properties characteristic of this individual or variation of the shared nature. It is something ultimately inaccessible to knowledge, as it is not shared with any other individual. All we know is it is there, as there is this individual being. Yet at the same time, this individual can be understood on the basis of the common nature that is really the individual before us. And this common nature is understandable to us, as it is shared between all beings of this kind. It guides our response to each of those individuals. But its unity is found only in our understanding of its abstraction from these individuals. Now, this made a lot of sense to me. The Thomistic understanding of signate matter is very appealing for those who look at mathematical physics at the bottom of reality. This is problematic, though, as mathematical physics does not provide an answer to the individuation of being. It presupposes it and then moves it ever further to the bottom, which leads to the reductionism that questions the reality of our own being. But what if we consider mathematical physics only as an abstraction from individual beings, finding its unity in describing reality as a whole, but understood only under one aspect? So what I want to understand is, how can we make distinctions between reality understood by way of physics and reality as we know it by way of living it? And here seems to be a way to do so. Duns Scotus speaks of formally distinct realities in the same thing. What he means is the reality of the thisness and the reality of the common nature in the same thing. The formal distinction is an expression of Scotus's argument that there must be distinctions that are not separable, like two components can be separated, but still real, and not just distinctions introduced by our understanding. He tries to find a midway point between those two. And this is precisely the argument that Ockham will later simply reject. He sees that it can lead to logically contradictory results. But what Scotus expresses takes seriously the intuitive understanding of reality. He argues that there must be unities in nature that are less than numerical unity, that are not quite one thing. For example, when two distinct beings are not the same yet similar, then they share something in reality that gives them their similarity. Differences are not all the same, and neither is unity all the same. By using the formal distinction and avoiding an all or nothing approach to unity, Scotus can argue for the reality and the unity of the shared nature, such as the human nature shared by each and every one of us, while also affirming the reality of its presence in each and every human being. This shouldn't be seen as some kind of philosophical mysticism. It's an attempt to use human reason to capture as accurately as possible something that is ultimately larger than what human reason can capture. Scotus takes us as far as one can go, using the tools of classical philosophy at his disposal. Now, Scotus' thinking of the formal distinction between hexeitas and nature of an individual being leads me to see how physics can be quite real, but that its full unity and logical consistency is found in its abstraction from real beings rather than in them. Therefore, it is one true way of speaking of everything, or speaking of the world in a very realistic way. However, it does not exclude that there's more than that can be truthfully said about an individual being before me. If I say that the groundhog is alive, then the absence of this concept in the physical sciences is of no importance. So what else is there to be learned by looking at individuals other than to abstract our knowledge of physics from them? Our understanding of the world begins with individual beings and the distinctions between them. We see the individuality of being most clearly in animals, and we can see it mostly in plants, where the distinctions between individual plants can become very difficult. It's obvious to distinguish trees, but considerably more complicated to distinguish grasses, mosses, and ferns. You may think that you can at least count cells in every living being, but even this gets ambiguous when you work with plasmodial slime molds, which actually was a model organism that I worked with at the very beginning of my biochemical career. I eventually graduated to more respectable creatures. It becomes an almost useless standard in inanimate matter, such as the groundhog, or just as the ground or dead wood littered all over it. You can see how the individuality of being comes as a matter of degree, and the degree by which it is there has something to do with being a living being. But all our understanding is expressed in making these very clear distinctions between kinds of beings and number of beings belonging to this kind. Remember the chemical formula of the poison. You really cannot do science without it. We can see it in science, but only because it is already there when we begin to do science, when we ask, what is this? And point, for example, to one of the groundhogs. We can ask, what is this? And point to a rock and determine the crystal structure of its minerals, which are individual atoms, each in its place of a lattice. And we can point at the atoms and ask, what is this? And the process continues. But where does this come from? If science is based in it, then science can hardly be expected to provide the answer to this question. Now, I discovered the significance of this question as I studied the work of the German philosopher Robert Spemann, to whom I'm very much indebted. I've been following his work as my own guide through philosophy. And the picture here is meant to exemplify the paradigmatic example of our relationship to reality. Self-conscious subjects know themselves to be objects of another person's knowledge. We discover both the other as an object of our subjectivity and also ourselves as the object of another's subjectivity. This understanding persuades us to become metaphysical realists. We cannot doubt our own existence any more than we can doubt our being perceived as the object of another's subjectivity. With this basic recognition, it all begins. Our whole encounter with reality and our understanding of it is mediated in this manner. Nothing just imprints itself on our minds like data on a hard drive. We acquire language and learn to articulate thoughts through interactions with others. We come to understand ourselves in the way we are understood by others. In this process, we discover ourselves as real beings in the world, but we also recognize ourselves as being distinct from other beings in the world. We are aware of it. It can be a feeling of loneliness, the knowledge of never being fully known by others. We cannot even properly know ourselves, as we're dependent on others for this. It's not just loneliness. It is also a feeling of relationship through the knowledge of being among beings. Some of them are persons, but there's also all else. But when we call someone a person, we express that we understand the difference between someone and something. The difference between a unique being and some vague pattern in the everything that may or may not be something. Someone is not just a transient pattern in something else, but an individual being. When we call someone a person, we express that we have recognized the individual being before us as one that has its own being in the same way that we have it, that we have our own. Now, one modern philosopher who was also inspired by the work of Duns Scotus was Martin Heidegger. And his understanding of Dasein, which is German for being there, or existence of being, with a capital B, begins with the awe and wonder, but also the fear of trembling at the fact of knowing that we are, that we exist. that we're given a life to live, to conduct, rather than just to endure it. It expresses not what we are, but that we are, and it emphasizes the wondrous fact that we exist rather than not exist. It is what the pronoun I points to when I say that I am, that I have a life to live. Now, Heidegger's Dasein is closely related to what it means to be a person, and is in no small part inspired by the philosophy of Duns Scotus and his understanding of hexeitas, or thisness. It refers to the fact of our individual existence and our knowledge of it, and our recognition of it in human beings. It is not a property. It is not something separable from the rest. It is in each and every one of us, each human being, understood as a being in the world that is its own and not possessed by anybody but itself. And this recognition of being leads to ethical obligations. The being of persons is a call to be recognized by other persons, and this makes it an ethical demand. One ought to respond. You may remember the symbol of the anti-slavery movement. Now, in spite of this image's powerful impact at the time, we now recognize something troubling in it in a very different way. It depicts the slave as if begging for freedom rather than demanding what is rightfully his and taking it by his own strength. Nobody likes to see himself as a powerless supplicant. But beyond its importance in the abolition of slavery in the British Empire, it remains a powerful depiction of the ethical demand that we encounter whenever we encounter anybody and recognize in him or her a human being and therefore a person. The slave is not just a slave, but like everyone who is not begging but asking the obvious question, for which there can only be one answer. Of course, he's a person like every other person. Of course, the chains he wears are evidence of a crime committed against him. He's not asking for anything. He's making a very powerful point. And it is striking that Francis, in the image with which my talk began, is depicted in a way very similar to this man. Just as Francis shows mercy, the man here shows mercy to us by pointing to our crime, offering us freedom to restore the right relationships with each other. We truly recognize our own personhood in the encounter with the other. We further recognize that it is human beings that are the beings who are persons. Being a person has nothing to do with any property or any social convention. Instead, calling someone a person is a consequence of having understood ontology. Human being is the being in the world that calls us to be recognized as persons, and their existence is a demand, an expression of rights. At the minimum, these rights are not to be enslaved, not to be abused, not to be killed. Now, ontology, the knowledge of being, is inseparable from ethics, or the knowledge of what to do with it all. When I begin with the recognition of persons as the first and most important ethical demand, then the rest follows from it by way of comparing the kind of being that I'm considering. I do not want to consider that I can draw clear lines between persons and other animals, or even between life in general and non-living matter. But you know that there are the differences of which I speak here. The being of persons comes with special rights and obligations, out of the recognition that a person possesses its being in a way that lower animals do not. My groundhog in the earlier picture is alive, but no groundhog has ever known about it. But there's more to the groundhog than simply a transient pattern of atoms that is forming. It is a living being, as such as it is real and endowed with rights, the right not to be abused. And we can use this gradient and understand how our ethical obligations change as we move from persons to mere matter. And we can notice that our scientific understanding actually goes in the opposite direction. Our ethical acting is very much an art, and it requires a lot of practice to do it well. It is not as clearly and unambiguously explained as science. But I want you to see that ethical obligation and scientific understanding do not oppose each other, even if they're quite clearly independent of each other. Ethical obligation comes with the understanding of what it means for something to be. Scientific understanding now allows us to respond to these obligations. Now I'm getting close to the end, so I just want to say a few words about another Franciscan, another medieval Franciscan, and this is Bonaventure of Bagno Reggio. And he was the Franciscan counterpart to Thomas of Aquinas, but on account of Bonaventure's exceptional skills in administration and diplomacy, his academic career was cut short. He was our Minister General in the Middle Ages, and he was given the task to make a proper religious order out of the very messy Franciscan fraternity. And when this was done, the Pope wanted him to reconcile the Orthodox churches of the East with Rome. And that he was given this rather large task tells you what an accomplishment it had been in the eyes of the Pope to bring order to the Franciscan Friars. He almost succeeded in the second task, but the reconciliation that he negotiated fell apart, and he died before he could put it back together again. But the passage which I put there is taken from The Journey of the Mind to God, which is a little book that he wrote while on retreat. And this little booklet has become a classic in spirituality. And it is the best introduction into the contemplative dimension of the Franciscan spirituality and our desire to be drawn into the mystery of God by the contemplation, or speculation in the language of Bonaventure, of created beings. Reflection on the being of things has an upward movement, corresponding to the increasing degrees of being as we go from inanimate to living to personal beings. And this leads to Christ, and through him to God. So this vision takes me back to Francis, and to conclude, I show the image which we just started. What he gives us is not a worldview, but a way of seeing the world. Not a reduction of one way of seeing everything, as if from the divine perspective that sees all and knows all. It is a different kind of reduction, a leading back to an origin, by finding the one center of all the ways of looking at the world and finding meaning in this way. Francis found Christ. If you cannot find him in such a moment, then I pray you can at least find persons in the world. The view of Francis is a view that takes very seriously that we can only look at the world from the inside as participants. Any worldview that attempts to speak of the whole as if looked at from the outside can only be an abstraction of what comes first, the view from the inside within a world of personal being in which we discover each other. You will have noticed that I haven't spoken at all about the mind and its freedom or purposeful acting in nature and the pursuit of goals and reaching of ends. Maybe you now share my conviction that it is futile to try and bring it all together in one all-encompassing worldview. Those who talk of everything end up saying nothing. There are many ways of looking at the world, such as the sciences or the arts or religion, but there's one center, one way to access all of them, and this is the human being, recognized as a person in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. We have time for a few questions.
So is the main idea of the lecture as a whole, is it about how physics and science as we know it is not sufficient to describe reality fully, because there's a not parallel but concurrent reality which can only be understood through recognizing that every person is different, and that recognition will also mean that there's a self, and through that different understanding of reality comes ethics and our moral obligations towards others?
I would put it a little bit differently. You are correct in understanding me in saying that I consider physics to be incomplete as a description of reality that has to be denied. I also want to emphasize that it is incomplete in a sense that it cannot be complemented by way of addition. The analogy that I've used a few times now is the relationship between a street map of Chicago and Chicago itself. No matter how many details you add to the street map, the map will never become the city, yet the map gives you accurate knowledge of the city. That is somewhat what I mean by physics being incomplete. Not incomplete by missing a piece here and there, but incomplete by having taken an approach that from the very outset abstracts the things I'm most interested in, which is life, personal being. Now, the significance of personal being, I want to emphasize, is in the existent as a self-possessed individual. That you and I, whether we differ or do not differ, doesn't even matter, but that each one of us is uniquely his own. It can never be fully shared with anybody else. Even the person closest to you will not know you completely. Even you yourself will not know yourself completely. This inner core of being, which is not property, but simply a fact of your existence as a person, is what I want to point out to. The differences that we all have is part of our individuality, but our individuality is not defined by those differences. That's the distinction. The differences we have mean we have different needs. Ethical obligations have to be corresponding to the type of being we have in front of us. You have different needs from me, and everybody else has different needs again. But my emphasis is simply that before we make sense of physics, we have to remember the understanding of being begins with personal beings. And that, by analogy, we apply to physics. And therefore the inability of physics to describe the whole does not say anything about the whole. It's just a methodological decision we made at the very beginning. It's somewhat analogous to the argument about God's existence not being a question provable or disprovable by physics. If you exclude from the outset certain answers, then you can't use the science you get by proving that point.
So Duns Buddhists had this idea that you're defined, or that you have different realities, but they're not, or they are distinct from each other, but you can't separate them. Is that?
Duns Scotus had a simpler worldview, as he didn't have to worry about physics in his age. The Middle Ages didn't have the physical understanding of the universe yet. So for him, the formal distinction was a way of articulating the science. He wouldn't have applied it in the way that I applied it. That is I consciously used him in a modern context and used an idea of his in a very different context. But the logical arguments for the legitimacy of the formal distinction are still quite valid. Because you could argue the formal distinction is just hand-waving. I'm saying it's the same, but it's not the same. And I can't explain it to you any better. That is not very satisfying. This is why William of Ockham threw it out, because couldn't stand this kind of thing. But fact is, there are things that we cannot describe any better than that. And by simply using the formal distinction as a tool that you can apply very subtly and very carefully, he was able to use it in a constructive way and not just do hand-waving. And emphasize insights such as the unity of the common nature is found in the understanding and not in the individual. In that way I can abstract the unity of physics in the understanding of physics without needing to then find it also in the individual form. Yes?
There's a program being conducted by the university that tries to help Catholic high school teachers how to show their students that science and religion are compatible. Because there's a big fear that once they start getting interested in science, they're going to lose all confidence in religious thinking. Is there a way for your approach to be moved into such a high school or pedagogical effort like that? And would that be a good ultimate goal for what you're describing?
It would be wonderful. I think educating Catholic teachers in our Catholic school system is a very high priority, and providing them with the tools to respond to evident concerns is a wonderful idea. But I think the issue goes a bit deeper, because what children say in school tends to be what they learn at home from their parents. There's a bigger picture. We live in a society that tends to dismiss the, how should I put it, that tends to agree on very little. And sometimes all we agree on is scientific evidence, and even that gets chipped away at the edges. And then all you have is consensus by way of science, and everybody agrees on it. It is just very dangerous to limit true knowledge to just what we agree on in the sciences, because then it really devalues the human person and we become just numbers in some kind of computational scheme. So yes, educating teachers and children is a big part of it, but the real problem is bigger than that. The real problem is our current scientific mindset and an individualism that recognizes individuality, but does so essentially by way of separation, as opposed to response to individual needs and compassionate care for those who need it the most.
So, kind of following on that theme of almost an apologetic look at this, I'm a chemist in the graduate school as well, following in your trade, so I can appreciate that experience that you've had with philosophy. But I've also had lots of conversations with my peers that involve this very, as you put it, appealingly reductionistic take on things. And I'm curious what sort of rebuttal would be sufficient to answer them, because often it takes the form of kind of that first evidence that you pointed out, this evidence of the incomprehensibility of individuation of being in physics. But often they'll just dismiss that kind of almost as O.F.M did, as just, well, that must just be illusory, that must just be our inability to reconcile the complex features of physics that are manifesting on these higher levels. So I was wondering, on kind of that very dismissive, reductionistic take, what would be an apologetic type of approach?
First, you have to accept that it's a very, very slow process. So in my own way of understanding, what I talked about today in an hour represents several years of slowly changing my mind. And this wasn't something I just came up with one morning and put on paper. When I engage somebody who asks me that question, like, are we just a bag of atoms, like Craig was asking me several times today, actually a good answer to that question is, well, if we are just a bag of atoms, what is the bag? Which is one way of going to the problem of unity. Even the question saying we're just atoms is being articulated in a way that assumes that there is a unity held together by the bag. And the question doesn't even question itself, which really makes it so empty. So what I do in practice when somebody challenges me with a question, and if it's a student, then I simply ask, well, what do you think of yourself? Are you as real or more real or less real than the atoms that you study in science class? And very few people have the guts to say, oh, absolutely no, for certain I'm just a bag of atoms. It's a collection of atoms, or assembly of atoms. That intuitively you're now throwing away so much of what you know to be real that the answer is at least not satisfactory.
Yeah, I almost, kind of my intuition there is that I actually have asked that question to people before, and their hard-fisted response is, well, yeah, of course. Even my own experience is just an illusion from physics, and there's no argument even happening here. But in a certain sense, I almost wonder, to what degree does that even destroy the coherence of physics itself? I mean, there's no even remotely valid perspective from which you can even ask a physical question if there is no person asking it.
Exactly. And why would a bag of atoms decide to study physics? It's kind of, you would ask your friend, if you're a bag of atoms, why can't you be quiet? This is kind of the obvious reality of human being is to ask questions and to try to convince, to ask people to follow you in your understanding. It's so natural to the human person. And then to deny it is kind of self-evidently true. But what it expresses is an unhappiness with an inability to truly find meaning in nature. There's a sense that, yes, there's nature, yes, we exist, and we seek meaning, and our search for meaning is real, but it corresponds to nothing in nature, in nothing in our created being as bodily creatures. There's a strict separation between body and mind. People who are strict physicalists or evolutionary biologists who deny anything beyond the material will often have very strong ethical convictions, very strong senses of wanting to explain, to convince, to lead, and to make sense, and leading humanity to deeper understanding of our own existence. They seek goodness, just as we do. But they do it by way of separation from nature. I find that unreasonable. Nature is comprehensible, and we are creatures in creation. We want to be in nature, understood by nature, and understand nature.
On the bag of atoms thing, so I run with a lot of people who like his peers, are pretty confident about that. I am so atoms. A subset of them are also pretty confident that they could be uploaded to a computer system at some point, maybe in the near future, because what's important about them, they reckon, is the patterns of neural activity. And so if those, we can't do it now, but if those could be captured, they could be digitized, and who I am could become immortal through persistence and software. So one could, you could say, oh, come on.
Sheldon you're on the Big Bang Theory.
Yeah, so, I mean, you can, aside from saying, you gotta be kidding, what could you add to my, you gotta be kidding?
All I can do is remind a person who argued that way that you're really presupposing what you're trying to show. So yes, if you could upload my mind into a computer and then download that again into some kind of machine that has the ability to move around, then yes, you would have proven your point and I would have been wrong. But I utterly refuse to acknowledge that what we are as human persons could be expressed in a computer. I do not believe that computers will ever have the power to become self-aware in the sense that we understand the term. I find that to be, on account of my understanding of computers being inanimate matter, I find it impossible to see how a computer could think in the way that we use this term. If I'm wrong, at least it can be proved. For scientists, that should determine.
So I have one question. This very rich approach, how would you distinguish this approach of sort of relativizing or insisting on the fundamentality of the lived experience of the human person as the starting point from which to explore scientifically the world, but do so in such a way as to insist on the inability of that investigation to capture something fundamental. How is that not, with respect to science, sort of instrumentalism about science? So I guess I'm asking you to reflect a little bit more. You touched on it some, but a little bit more on how you think that the sciences are getting at something real, but at the same time somehow they are, in principle, unable to sort of explain away the person. To me that sounds like, well, the sciences are getting at reality, but as soon as they touch what I care about, I'm going to say they're just instrumental tools for sort of manipulating and getting around in my personal world.
My analogy of the street map would be consistent with the interpretation of my understanding of science as being instrumental. So I'm not entirely sure whether I would say that I would deny that. It just seems to me that instrumental seems to imply the possibility that nature is completely different and just happens to be described by physics in the way we do, simply on account of our having designed machines in this way and historical coincidences and stuff like that. That I find hard, if not impossible, to believe on account of the success and the consistency of the mathematical description of the physical sciences. Something which is so not only practically successful, but which goes so deeply into the foundation of all of our observations, which can describe things as diverse as the color of your shirt and the spectral distribution of microwave background radiation. That must be telling me something about reality as it really is. So the success of physics, unless it's a miracle, would suggest that it speaks to reality as it really is. So that's the reason why I prefer to take a realistic view at physics, but qualify it in that way. and I wouldn't call it instrumentalism unless I have to. The other question to keep in mind is, we have to remember, like in a good trial of law, which side is being asked to prove its case. And who wrote that, or who ruled that physics is taken as true, but what I knew as a child, very basic insights as a child, are now false. And I have to prove that they're true on account of physics. That reduction of permitting evidence for public debate ought to be justified in itself. I would say that what I know first, and what is most generally shared in knowledge, has a priority that ought to be acknowledged. What we all know, before we do anything else, should be acknowledged as valid knowledge that can be questioned, we can make mistakes, but it shouldn't be dismissed out of hand and replaced with physical sciences as knowledge that is indubitably true.
Let's thank our speaker again.